Good evening. This is Tewkesbury Museum on your screens at the moment. Any volunteer or trustee at Tewkesbury Museum will tell you that it's rather like an iceberg. Now, I'm not talking about the temperature or humidity levels within the building, although there's that too, but the fact that such a small portion of the museum's collection is visible to the casual observer. In the museum, we have around 6,700 items. There's a wealth of fascinating exhibits on display, from the fairground models to a pair of elaborately decorated truncheons that I think one would hesitate to actually use as truncheons are intended to be used. But stored away in cupboards and boxes, there are many more interesting artifacts. One example is this copper printing plate, which has been in the museum since 1966. If it was on display, it is unlikely that visitors would give it more than a quick glance. So the challenge for us is to discover and communicate its backstory in order to attract to it the attention it deserves. A visual examination of the plate shows that it is made of copper and is covered in regular rows of scratches. I took photographs and then flipped them horizontally to see if the scratches made any sense. They did. I found that on the surface of this plate, there is a reversed image of a letter dated 1862. And by zooming in this enlargement, I hope you can read some of the words. I can see the words sermon and meeting and the present. This is a printing plate then, made so that a large batch of identical images of a letter could be created, ready to send to multiple recipients. It is so very easy for us today to send a mass email or to create many laser printed copies of the same letter. Is that okay?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, right. Just by pressing a button. But for Victorians, the writing of a letter to a large number of different people was quite a challenge. The original letter would have been written by hand on paper, but then it would have been subjected to a succession of different processes in order to produce multiple copies. You have probably heard of Copperplate script. Throughout the history of handwriting, the shape and form of lettering has been dictated by the characteristics of the tools and materials used to form it. For example, the serifs on Roman characters were always cut first, so that when letters were chiseled into a stone surface, the serifs prevented the stone at the ends of the strokes from cracking. Quill pens were difficult to operate by pushing them to create upward strokes. So writing with a quill involved drawing the nib towards you, and that would have influenced the style of the script. Only when steel nibs became available could you push the nib away from you without damaging the surface you were writing on. Many people who were educated during the latter half of the 19th century and the first few decades of the 20th century were taught to write in a copperplate style. The shape and formation of the letters in copperplate script is such that it works with the characteristics of the tools and materials that are used in scratching onto a metal plate with a sharp pointed tool that is pushed away from you. Being able to write in a copperplate style was an essential first step in being able to produce a large batch of identical letters to different people. The copperplate style of handwriting also has an advantage in that it's very clear and easy to read. I guess it was the Helvetica or Arial of its day. The original handwritten letter would first have been copied onto tracing paper. The tracing would have then been transferred onto a copper plate, but before this happened, the plate would have been treated to remove any grease and then dabbed all over with an acid-resistant substance called ground. And in this picture here, you can see the printer's apprentice with his dabber coating the printing plate with ground. When the script was transferred from the tracing onto the plate, the transferred lines would show up brightly against the dark colour of the ground. An etching tool called a burin, and we've got several burins here on this picture, would have been used to scratch along the transferred markings, thus exposing the copper. Most burins are square in cross section and cut at an angle of 45 degrees at the end, and that means that you get a nice sharp point at the end and two sharp edges that you can cut the copper with. The engraver would have used the burin in a way that most closely emulated the effect of using a pen nib by holding it at a shallow angle from the plate and slightly tilted towards one of the sharp edges. This would have produced the slightly feathery effect you get from a pen nib on paper if you apply the pressure more on one side of the nib than the other. Engraving was a slow, painstaking process, as the slightest scratch in the wrong place would spoil the final outcome. The plate was then dipped in nitric acid, which would corrode the exposed areas of copper to create a series of pits and channels in the surface of the plate. After rinsing off the acid, the printer's apprentice would have removed the ground from the plate. Now the plate was ready for the printing process. The printer would have coated the plate with a thick, oily ink before carefully wiping the surfaces clean. This would leave all the engraved pits and channel in the surface of the plates full of ink. The more deeply etched they were, the more ink they could hold, and the bolder the printed effect would be. Finally, the print would have been placed face upwards on a printing table, and a sheet of paper would have been placed over the top of it. And this printing table lies between two rollers, and there's this big handle here, this big wheel, which the printer would have turned. And as he turned it, the press would have exerted a huge force to push the paper down into the ink pits and channels on the plate as this printing table passed between the rollers. This action would have transferred the image of the letter onto the paper. The inking and printing process would have been repeated up to thousands and thousands of times, and to ensure that the final image was of an equally high quality as the first, this copperplate process was essential. One of the challenges that we face today when sending a letter to numerous recipients at once is to ensure that we don't breach GDPR rules. That wasn't an issue for the Victorians. Another challenge is to ensure that it doesn't end up in the spam box or the recycling bin. There is, and probably always has been, a degree of mistrust with respect to mass communications. The writers of this letter would have been aware of this, so they chose the copperplate method, as it was and still is the best way of creating multiple copies of a handwritten letter. Great care was taken in the preparation of this printing plate, which is very evident when you examine it. Raw copper plates don't have a smooth polished surface, and their edges are rough and sharp, so this plate was burnished before it was etched. And you can see this apprentice on this picture here. He's actually finishing the copper plate, so he's probably already burnished it, and he's working on the edges, and he would have used a file to bevel the edges and also to round off the corners of the plate. And that's so that they don't become embossed onto the paper when it's being printed. And this is our copper plate in the museum, and that you can just see the light shining on the beveled edge there, and this very pronounced curved corner. The paper onto which the images were printed would have had a very smooth, fine-grained surface, and the forces used in transferring the image to the paper would have given the finished article a three-dimensional look and feel. So the letters that were printed from this plate would have looked and felt as close as possible to the hand-scripted article. We can therefore surmise that this letter was important, as its production was carried out with such care, attention to detail, and therefore expense. So what was it about to warrant such an investment? By reversing my photograph of the plate, I've been able to discover that the letter was written in Cheltenham in 1862, and it says, "Dear Sir, allow me to submit for your consideration the accompanying papers of the Colonial and Continental Church Society, and to request on its behalf your support and cooperation by kindly consenting to have a sermon or meeting for it in the course of the present or of the ensuing year. The favour of a reply will greatly oblige. I remain, dear sir, yours respectfully, Association Secretary, Southwestern District. And there was room for the secretary to actually sign the letter by hand down here.
Yeah, lots of copies actually.
The Colonial and Continental Church Society was a Foreign Office-backed charity that funded the provision of priests and teachers in English-speaking communities around the world. In the early 1860s, the British government was cutting back its foreign aid budget, so charities like this one were encouraged to fill the gap. Its president, Lord Bathurst, lived in Gloucestershire, and the society was based in Cheltenham, holding its annual meetings at Cheltenham Town Hall. During the years that followed the production of this letter, there were numerous newspaper reports of public meetings and sermons in support of the society all over England, Ireland, and the Channel Islands, from Durham to London, Cork, St Helier, and many other towns in between, but not, as far as I can tell, in Tewkesbury. The society was certainly in need of funds. In February 1864, it had debts amounting to around £1,500, and the Tewkesbury Register and Gazette carried an article that observed how much easier it was to raise money for the destruction of men than for the saving of their souls. In June 1865, however, most churchgoers in Cheltenham would have had the opportunity to hear a sermon about the work of the society, and by June 1866, they would have heard the happy news that donations were increasing. We can infer then that the fundraising campaign, in which this letter played a key part, was successful. The society still exists today, although it is now called the Commonwealth and Colonial Church Society, and it supports education in English-speaking communities all around the world. Originally, the Newfoundland Society for Educating the Poor, which was established in 1823, it gradually amalgamated with other similar organisations and evolved into becoming the Colonial and Continental Church Society in 1861. So this letter would have raised awareness of the charity in its new identity. Although the original intent of the society had been to provide teachers, schools, priests and churches in Newfoundland, by the 1860s, its activities had extended south into Nova Scotia. And here we have a picture of the 3 Mile House School, which is in Fairview, which is near Halifax, Nova Scotia. And this complex was built by the society. And also the society's activities extended southwest towards Quebec and Montreal, and they established a theological college by the Huron River. And they established schools for French-speaking Roman Catholic children around Quebec and Montreal. At that time, the Anglican Church was far more active in Canada than the Roman Catholic Church, so the Colonial and Continental Church Society provided the best opportunity for French-speaking children in and around Quebec to gain an education. And if we look on the map, we can see that this red dot here represents Stoneham, Tewkesbury, and it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that children from Stoneham, Tewkesbury benefited from the charity's work, although I haven't yet been able to establish that they did. However, it is known that the society made the mistake of assuming that those who had received education and spiritual guidance from them were somehow anglicised by their association, and that assumption caused considerable resentment and a firm determination to retain French heritage. It is good that now, through Anne Carlis's work at our own Tewkesbury Library, that we have communication with the people of Stoneham, Tewkesbury, and we might be able to find out more about it. If you have not seen the film from Stoneham that was created for the Tewkesbury's Together Festival last year, I strongly recommend that you find the link to the film on the Town Council's website. And up here we have a picture of Stoneham, Tewkesbury. You can see it really does look like sort of missionary country, doesn't it? Sort of the terrain. But coming back to the plate, what is its relevance to Tewkesbury? The museum's accession book gives us no clue. It merely states that the plate was donated to us by William Mayle in 1966. William Mayle was born in 1895 and died in 1980. Research indicates that the Mayles were a well-established Tewkesbury family who lived in York Road. William's father was a house painter, and he was also a veteran of the Boer War and the First World War. And his mother's family ran a confectioner's shop in the town. But did the Mayle family have a connection with the printing industry or with the Colonial and Continental Church Society? I can't find one, and I don't know why the plate was in William Mayle's possession. Was the plate prepared and the letter printed here in Tewkesbury? The local directory of 1861 lists 4 printing businesses here, but none of them is identified as a copperplate printer. Tewkesbury's printers seem to have used the cheaper letterpress printing process. Copperplate printing is in a completely different league in both the terms of cost and the techniques involved and the quality of the product. So if you were a copperplate printer, you would definitely let people know that. There was a copperplate printer in Gloucester, so perhaps the plate was made there. But maybe the most important thing that we at Tewkesbury Museum can learn from this plate is how important it is to collect and record as much information as possible about each item in the accession. In the early days of the museum in Barton Street, people were encouraged to donate anything they had that was old or interesting. It didn't necessarily have to have a Tewkesbury provenance as it does today. I have not found out anything about this plate that links it to Tewkesbury, although since it was made for a Cheltenham-based organisation, perhaps Cheltenham is where it belongs, and we need to have the conversation about whether this plate should be relocated there. For me, the plate prompts other conversations too. If we have all these wonderful hidden things in our museum, shouldn't we be sharing them with the people of Tewkesbury? Shouldn't we be inviting the people of Tewkesbury to become co-curators with us in deciding what stories we should be telling about our wonderful, rich heritage? Whether or not the plate has a rightful place here in Tewkesbury Museum, it is unremarkable without its backstory, which enables us to appreciate the care and craftsmanship that was invested in its manufacture and understand the insight it gives us into another facet of a Victorian life. We can note that the Victorians were tussling with some of the same issues that we do and going through the same thought processes, although I think they displayed far more patience and care than we tend to in realising their outcomes. In that letter, nothing is spelt incorrectly, and there are no rogue apostrophes lurking where they are not needed. I do wonder if, a century and a half from now, our most important emails and social media pages will become museum exhibits, and if anyone will care to analyse, understand and appreciate the care and attention to detail that we invested in them. I kind of suspect not, and it makes me a little sad to think that such a significant part of our everyday lives is so ephemeral. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much then, Joanne. So thank ever so much. I was fascinated to know what you were going to be talking about tonight. And you sort of worried me when I looked at that. It makes you think how much effort people had to do to print in numbers in those days compared with our own bulletin, which would have been a nightmare to have done in copperplate. I wish I'd been taught copperplate, then perhaps people could read my writing. But really, very interesting. Thank you for opening our minds to what's in our museum. I hope people will find the time as the weather improves to come and visit the museum to see what's in there. And perhaps Joanne will show us what she's been talking about today. So, Madam Mayor and Madam Chairman of Trustees of the Museum, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.